Welcome, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled today to have a conversation once again with Dr. Justin Sledge all about John Dee and his system of Enochian magic. Welcome. You're really someone who needs no introduction. I think if you're on YouTube looking at esotericism, people have come across your channel, but please go ahead and introduce yourself and some of the stuff you're working on.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. Yeah, my name is Justin Sledge. I host a channel called Esoterica. That's an academic channel that focuses on the study of Western esotericism, mostly before about 1750. And so, yeah, I'm an academic. I study Western esotericism. This weekend I've been reading a lot of Kabbalah, so my brain's a bit like scrambled eggs at this point. But yeah, that's what I do. What am I working on now these days? I have a lot of irons in the fire. I'm actually working on distilling an absinthe with a local distillery, which is a whole big
Wow,
project that's
cool.
been a lot of fun. I have the rare book business. Might be teaching a class in Cairo in February on sort of mystical ascent technologies of the ancient world. So that is proving to be pretty exciting. I hope it all works out. So yeah, I have a couple of irons in the fire, and then of course it's just like the job of creating content, basically on the weekly on topics in Western esotericism, which, as you know, is no easy task.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's amazing to see coming from you such consistent and high quality work. I really admire that. And for the people who are interested in amazing learning opportunity, that Cairo trip is going to be incredible from the sounds of it. So, what a
I
great
hope it.
opportunity.
Yeah, and also I'm teaching a class on Cornelius Agrippa. I was just had that lecture today, so yeah, so really a lot going on. But yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I hope that all
wonderful.
works out, and I really appreciate being invited on your channel.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for joining me again. I love our conversation. So, speaking of conversations, in our prior conversations, you've mentioned how much you appreciate hearing a practitioner's perspective on things you research academically. What are your thoughts about the emic versus etic divide? In other words, the perspective that you cannot be a scholar of something in which you participate. Is the notion of a scholar and also magical practitioner an oxymoron?
Yeah, this is a great question. It'd be an even better question, I think, for Dr. Angela Puka, my colleague. She's a religious anthropologist, so she would have much more intelligent things to say about this than perhaps I will. Um, I don't think there's any fundamental contradiction between being a practitioner of something and studying it academically. Uh, Academics is just a methodology, and if you adopt the methodology and you do it properly, it doesn't. I can't understand why anyone would have any concerns about that whatsoever. And I will say this, is it seems like that no one actually has any concerns about this as long as you're a member of the right religions. So if you're a Christian and you're studying Thomas Aquinas, or if you're Jewish and you're studying Kabbalah, I don't think anyone ever looked askew at Gershom Scholem or Moshe Idel and said, "Hey, you can't really be studying this stuff because you're part of the religion." Um, it's particularly, it seems like it only seems to get levied against occult practitioners, which is, I think, is part of just an overriding academic, or rather an overriding bias, even perhaps bigotry against occult practitioners, or people who subscribe to fringe. What I really mean by fringe is minority. We should hear that as
Mm-hmm.
minority spiritualities. And to me, that's just representative of a long-standing uh, bigotry and bias in academia. So no, I think as long as you're willing to, bracket yourself into the methodologies, into the mainstream norms that is how academia works, then I can't imagine why you couldn't be a published academic in Thelema by day and a Thelemite by night, and
Yeah.
there'd be no problems there whatsoever. And I think that academics have rubbed some practitioners the wrong way,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
I know they have. I've talked to practitioners who've told me as much, and well, I can speak for myself saying that I hope I do right by the practitioner community, because I don't want to be part of a problem, and I don't want to be part of a um, contentious relationship between the two. I really want to be, you know, doing my part to serve the communities that I belong to, which is the academic community on the one hand, and also my work insofar as it's being taken up and used by practitioners. I want that to be an environment where they feel appreciated and welcomed, and really admired. I always talk about, it's so easy to be born into a religion and kind of just do it. typically you're not born into esoteric spiritualities. You really
Mhm.
have to work at it. And I really admire again, that kind of spiritual athleticism. So I don't see that there's any fundamental contradiction between the idea of scholar practitioner. I think if you're a scholar and you're doing it and you're also a practitioner, as long as you're maintaining rigorous academic standards, great. Have fun.
Yeah, that's so beautifully put. I love hearing that perspective from a scholar. And, speaking from my own personal experiences, I have definitely ran into that attitude before, especially from scholars that, trying to keep them separate. And for me, that's always been a bit discriminatory, I guess. Um, so it's great to hear and refreshing to hear you say that. I feel very validated.
It's just bizarre to me. And I've gotten this question a couple of times, and I've gotten it mostly from practitioners who've experienced, I think, discrimination at some
Mm-hmm.
level. And one, I'm sorry for that. That's terrible. And two, um, I would love to see the argument from someone who thinks that you can't do both. I just have never heard a good argument
Yeah.
that you. I've just, and again, coming from a philosophy background, to me, all that matters is what is the actual argument for something. And if your argument is I don't like it, or it makes me uncomfortable, or
Mhm.
you know, like, that's not really a intellectually rich argument.
No, I
um,
agree. Yeah.
so yeah, I don't buy it. So yeah, I don't see any fundamental contradiction or oxymoron between practitioners of any religion and good academic standards. They become uphold both of them.
Yeah, very well said. So you have nearly 70,000 subscribers on YouTube. What do you think that says about the interest in a more scholarly approach to esotericism?
Yeah, the channel's grown a lot. It's a pretty big channel. I think we're expected to get to a million sometime next year, which is absolutely bizarre. Some people joke that you can't call it esoterica when you have a million subscribers. Yeah,
Woohoo!
it's like now it has to be exoterica. So I think what it says is that there's a lot of interest in this material, and there's a lot of interest in this material from an academic perspective, mostly because insofar as academia is neutral, and I won't say objective because I don't know what objective is, but I don't have a vested interest in any of this stuff. I'm not a practitioner. I don't the metaphysical beliefs that I do in fact hold personally are in some ways inimical to much of the material that I study. And I think people like that because they know that at some level I'm not like secretly rooting for one team. I'm not like, yeah, the Gnostics, or whatever. And so I think that just shows that people are really interested in getting sort of a very data driven, a very evidence based, and a very unslanted by personal beliefs, an approach to this material. And as you know, right, there's so much insanity that goes along with esotericism, and unfortunately gets
Oh,
wrapped up with racism and all kinds of conspiracy theories and stuff like that. It becomes adjacent to that. And I think people are really happy to know that that's just not going to happen on my channel. I'm not,
mm-hmm.
this is not like secretly some kind of all white people came from Atlantis, or whatever. And so uh, there are really people out there that believe that stuff.
Yeah.
So I think a scholarly approach just gives everyone access to the material, which that means everybody from, hardcore atheists who are just interested in weird history, all the way to people building out D&D worlds. I get a lot of people who are like big D&D players, and they use historical stuff to inform their D&D games, all the way to, practitioners who really are like, I want to get into Enochian magic, but I really have no idea how the Heptarchia Mystica actually worked or what it was. And so it gives them at least some in to be able to get to the material in a way that isn't, um, the Enochian, how to do the Heptarchia Mystica, but filtered through the lens of this Golden Dawn tradition or this tradition of Thelema or this particular internet guru. And those are all legitimate and perfectly wonderful avenues into the material. But for someone who just wants to know what does the actual manuscripts preserve? What do we actually know from those manuscripts? So I think that there's something like that as well that people just want access in that way, and then they do with it what they think is best. So I think
Yeah.
that's the stuff that drives it. I hope that I'm always as scholarly as I can, and I've made mistakes, and I've made videos where I've said, "Hey, I messed that up," and I think I've rethought this. Um, so I think that gives people an idea that the channel is both very sympathetic to the material, but also maintains critical academic distance. And I think that gives people, that gives a broader community of people an in to get access to the material. And for me, ultimately, that's what it's all about. It's about
Yeah.
accessibility. That that so much of this material has been gate-kept and suppressed and repressed by the Inquisition or hidden in the dark corners of libraries all throughout the world or whatever. And um, I may not support any one school, but I do support accessibility to those schools, especially for people for whom this material is of profound spiritual value. They deserve to have access to the material.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And the one thing you mentioned I never even thought about before is people using this sort of information for D&D. That's so
Mhm.
interesting. I'd love to hear that sort of, as someone who's a practitioner, I do love to see that creativity and I love to see what people do with it. So that's really neat.
Yeah, it's great, and also just like people making movies and making music, and this is a huge
Yeah.
range of things. But yeah, I'm a DM, and I've played Dungeons and
Oh,
Dragons for
fun.
years.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Same. I
uh,
love playing D&D.
yeah, it's great. I love it, and it's people are always like, I'd love to see you DM. There is a part of me that says, what I'd love to do is do like a Twitch fundraiser where a bunch of us esoteric people, uh, do a D&D session and then use it as a fundraiser to like raise money to support, you know, uh, whatever, thing we could all agree upon to give the money to. But yeah, I'd love to do something like that. It'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, that'd be super fun. So I do have a lot of John Dee questions for you, but I have one more that I think would be really relevant for my audience since my audience is a lot of ceremonial magicians and people who are more practitioner based. So
Sure.
as someone who studies Kabbalah myself and does talk about it on my channel, how do you respond to claims about traditions like Thelema or the Golden Dawn that people say have appropriated Judaism by building their system around a Western esoteric interpretation of Kabbalah?
I mean, they certainly tried to appropriate it. I don't know if they did a very good job. If I'm going to be very honest, you look in 777 and some of those Hebrew words are misspelled and they're not translated well. And so they sure tried to
Mhm.
appropriate it at some level. Um, so two things are true at the same time, and they're not exactly they're complementary ideas, but not quite contradictory ideas. The first thing that we have to admit that's true is that the importation of Kabbalistic material from the Jewish world into the non-Jewish world, whether that was the Renaissance Christian world or the 19th century occult world, um, that has always been an asymmetric extraction that has been appropriative. And in the case of Christian Kabbalah, it was extracted with the expressed interest of using it against Jewish people as a way of trying to basically intellectually force them to convert to Christianity. That's just what Pico was doing when he was doing that work. That's less so of Reuchlin and less so of Postel and less so of Agrippa, but it has its roots in that kind of anti-Jewish uh, anti-Jewish agenda. So that's just that. That's just a historical fact. Now, we should be careful not to commit the genetic fallacy that just because something began in a certain kind of way that it's doomed forever. And I think that two things are true in this respect. The first thing that's true is if Jewish people, Kabbalists, publish books, that they're out there, and nobody can complain about someone reading your book. You published the damn thing. Like that's what you're wanting, is that when you publish a book, when you put an idea out there, well, it's out there, and anyone can make of it what they will, and that's just the nature of publishing. So you can't boohoo and cry about the fact that non-Jewish people are reading your books, or that occultists have gotten a hold of the Sefer Yetzirah and now they're like doing weird things with it in the ritual. I'm like, you shouldn't have published the damn thing. That's your fault. That's not their fault. They're just doing what everyone does when ideas get out in the marketplace of ideas. So that's the first part. The second is that um, insofar as one gets into historical Kabbalah, traditional Kabbalah, Jewish Kabbalah, it becomes increasingly impossible to not go into the direction of practicing Judaism, because at some level Kabbalah is incomprehensible without the practice of Judaism. In fact, the practice of Judaism is the theurgical element of Kabbalah. When people ask, well, what is practical Kabbalah? I'm like, being an Orthodox Jew. I mean, it's amulets and stuff sometimes, but it's mostly just like keeping Shabbat or not eating things or doing this and doing that, praying in certain kinds of ways. And I think that if a person finds themselves increasingly interested in Kabbalah, traditional Kabbalah, and they find themselves interested in Judaism, I think the thing to do there is to reach out to a local member of the Jewish community and say, hey, I have this interest. How can I be in dialogue with the community?
Hmm.
And I've never I've never heard of a story where a person says, I'm getting interested in Kabbalah, I'm getting interested in Judaism, I'm not interested in converting, but I would just like to talk to you guys. That is almost always very much welcomed, even by Orthodox rabbis. And so I say that it's not a question of is it appropriative or is it not. The question is there a relationship with the material that is about reciprocity, that's about respect, and about the communities of people for whom this is still a spiritual practice going back for hundreds of years. So no, I don't think that Kabbalah is closed practice, whatever,
Hmm.
I don't think that's true. I do think, though, that insofar as you get deeper into Kabbalah, it becomes impossible not to have some engagement with Judaism. And if you're having some engagement with Judaism and you don't want to have an engagement with the Jewish people, probably something wrong there.
Mm-hmm.
Something's
Definitely.
off. Something's off. There's some anti-Semitism. There's something going on there.
Hmm.
So I would just say that if that interest arises, reach out to a local, Chabad rabbi or Orthodox rabbi or Reform rabbi, whatever you feel the most comfortable reaching out to, and be like, hey, I want to learn more about this in a community of people for whom this is a important spiritual path. So yeah, I'm not on this whole like, being Jewish myself and a Jewish educator and the husband of a rabbi. I'm not on the camp of how dare you read the Sefer Yetzirah. I'm like, you can buy the thing on Amazon. Like, what do you want? What do you want people to not read? What I mean, what are we asking people to be anti-intellectual? Like, that's a bizarre. It's like a bizarre way of
Hmm.
respecting a culture by not trying to read its literature because
Yeah.
it's appropriative or something. I'm like,
Hmm.
no, read the literature, and if it really speaks to you, then you might want to get in touch with the community of people for whom that they produced it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think you nail it by saying respect and reciprocity. And I often think about, and also asking the question of where you're spending your money, but also your time and your energy. Maybe you can't afford to support by buying books, but you can show up to the community, and talk to, like you said, and get involved there and maybe volunteer, whatever that looks like for you. But yeah, I do. I am aware of this anti-intellectual current sometimes that tracks this idea of closed versus open. I mean,
Mhm.
obviously there are circumstances where that is the case, that this is a closed practice, et cetera, et cetera. But in this case we're talking about, I I sort of feel like if something is true, you should pursue that truth with respect.
Yeah, and
Um,
also,
that's
I
just my
mean,
opinion.
no, I agree, and I mean, Kabbalists historically, I can't say for now, but historically, Kabbalists published books on Kabbalah because they thought that it was sort of hymnatizing the Eshkatan. It was bringing the Messiah faster by getting this information out there. There's that feeling changed after the whole Shabbatai Tzvi incident, but there's always been a push to publish Kabbalistic literature and to have people study it. So yeah, I think that in this case, again, I can only speak for Kabbalah. I can't speak for
Yeah.
hoodoo or root work or anything. That's not, those
Mhm.
aren't my traditions, and I can't speak for those. But I can say for in the case of Kabbalah, this is a complicated thing because on the one hand, it does have this really negative history where outsiders have tried to use it against the people that developed it. And that's just true, and there's no getting rid of that. But that doesn't doom non-Jewish people from being able to appreciate and utilize the spiritual technologies that are to be found in the Kabbalah. I'll also guess say one other thing is that I would really encourage people, especially ceremonial practitioners, for whom Kabbalah and Hebrew and Gematria are important parts of those practices, to study historical Kabbalah and traditional Kabbalah because just to be very honest, the guys in the 19th century that developed a lot of this stuff, they got a lot wrong and they didn't understand stuff. And when they were just trying to, you know, shove things into correspondences. Like, yeah, Binah has to correspond to Saturn or something. And like it doesn't. That's just not the way that the Sphirot work and traditional Kabbalah. It just avails you of the ability to look at the tradition that you received, and you can actually see the places where the people who developed this stuff in the 19th century, whether it's Alan Bennett or Crowley or whatever, where frankly they didn't have a great understanding of this material, not because they weren't trying, they were trying as hard as they could. It's just it wasn't translated, and they didn't read Hebrew very well, and things are a lot further along than they are now. So I would say that it's a chance to enrich and deepen the role that the Hebrew language or the Sphirot or other Kabbalistic ideas, it will actually enrich those practices more because you don't have to rely on very much out of date 19th century understandings of Kabbalah.
Yeah, those are some fantastic points, and I think it's worth mentioning. One of the books I frequently recommend, or several books I frequently recommend people read is the Zohar,
Mhm.
to return back to that text because so much of what we're doing today also goes back to that.
Yeah, and the Zohar is ancient.
It's daunting, but I just want to say to viewers and listeners, you can do it. I believe in you. Go read the Zohar, please.
Yeah, it's tough. The Zohar is a very very difficult text. Yeah, me and my colleague and friend Zevi and I studied. We did what's called chavrusa, which is sort of traditional Jewish pair study. We studied an entire uh, section of the Zohar called the Yanuka, and I think it ended up taking us 14 hours of study to
Wow.
work through the entire section, which I think in the Zohar in the Aramaic of the Zohar is only about 15 pages. So
Yeah.
it's tough. It's tough going. It's tough going.
I'm
Also, I would
still not through the entirety of the Zohar myself, but it's on my wish list of texts to get
yeah.
through. I come back to it every once in a while and I'm like, whoa.
Yeah, if you're reading the Pritzker edition, I highly recommend not reading volume one first. The first volume of the Zohar is actually written as like an advanced overview of stuff. It was
Mm,
written toward the end of the production of the Zohar. I always tell people start with volume 11. Volume 11 contains a text called the Midrash HaNe'ilam, and that's the earliest text of the Zohar, and it's the most approachable.
okay,
So
great.
volume 11 is where I tell people like, don't start with number one, start with number 11, and then work your way back.
Awesome.
Because volume 11, like I said, has the Midrash HaNe'ilam in it, and that's the most approachable section of Zohar for someone who's just getting started with that text.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that suggestion too. I think a lot of, not just me, but I think a lot of people will really appreciate that suggestion. And to switch gears a little bit, because I got you on here to interview you, and I've got to talk to you about John Dee as a scholar and researcher in that area. And you also have some amazing videos on John Dee's Enochian system on your YouTube channel and the heptarchical systems. But your master thesis, you chose the Monus Hieroglyphica as your subject. What drew you to Dee's Hieroglyphic Monad, and what did your research uncover?
Um, so yeah, basically the entire reason that I went to graduate school in Amsterdam to study esotericism was to basically to, shake out the willies of my interest in John Dee. I just had this long-standing interest in Dee and Enochiana since I was in high school, basically. And I just like, I really want to like settle these issues for myself. I just want to spend a whole couple years working on John Dee. But the reason why I chose to work on the Monus Hieroglyphica is two reasons. The first is that it's a hard text. It's been described by Brian Vickers as the most obscure book ever written by an Englishman, and I would say that's true. It's a very very difficult, very strange little book. And the second is that I thought at the time, and maybe I still believe it, that I had a unique skill set going into doing the interpretive work of it, which is to say, I come out of a philosophy background. Most people who come into the academic study of esotericism, are typically coming from a history background, a religious studies background, or something like that. And my background's philosophy. That's what and so um, insofar as Monus Hieroglyphica is a representation of a specific kind of philosophy, and specifically a philosophy about metaphysics and symbols, I've done a lot of work in semiotics. And so what I brought to bear was a strong interest in metaphysics and the relationship metaphysics had with semiotics. And I combined those in an analysis of the hieroglyphic monad. And also I put it sort of in its context, like what's going on in 16th century metaphysics and what's going on in 16th century semiotics, a theory of representation, and how are those working themselves out in the broader space that Dee's working in, but specifically in the Monas Hieroglyphica. And so I think that what I was able to do was show that while it was obscure, there were central core philosophical ideas that Dee was grinding, and those are recognizable only if you see it as part of this larger crisis of 16th century representation, where the sort of revivalist realism has come out, and Dee really pushes that to the end. He really goes more extreme than anyone else. So that was basically it. It was I felt like that I had not read a good philosophical study of the Monas Hieroglyphica, and it's short enough that I could basically do a master's thesis on it, and that's ultimately what I ended up doing.
Wonderful. And I'm going to ask this question mainly for the practitioners who are approaching this perhaps maybe for the first time. I've certainly talked quite a bit about Enochian, but what would you say, especially as a scholar, are the essential manuscripts or texts by John Dee if you wanted to understand his contributions to the occult? Which ones would you recommend?
Well, obviously the most famous things, right, are going to be the two sets of manuscripts, the Cotton Appendix, which becomes the True and Faithful Relation, which I don't recommend people read that just on its own. It's a very difficult text to read on its own. And then of course the five books of mystery. So the five books of mystery plus the text that becomes True and Faithful Relation. Those together become basically the journals that we have that have survived that document the conversations with angels. And that's what I think most people are going to be going for if they're interested in John Dee stuff. They're going to be trying to tease out from those diaries the so-called Enochian system, which I think there's 4 or 5 different systems, and most of them are in various states of incompleteness in those texts. The angels seem to change their mind and go do something else or whatever. But those are coming out. Those are the two most important. Joseph Peterson, who one of the greatest people on the internet, who's been working with manuscripts, and he's just a fantastic guy. He's putting out a new edition of the five books of mysteries. So I would really highly recommend people get that. I think it's coming out in the fall. And then there's the complete record of the Spirit Diaries, which you can also pick up, that contains a modernized version of the True and Faithful Relation. If you want, from a practitioner point of view, I think the books that do the best balance of striking a balance between the interest of practitioners and the actual scholarship of the manuscripts is the work by Aaron Leach. Aaron Leach in my opinion, has the best grasp on the actual texts, and I think the recreations he develops are the most I want to say authentic, because I'm not here to judge what's authentic, what's not authentic, but they're the closest to the manuscripts. So if you want to reproduce what Dee and Kelly were doing, that's going to get you the closest.
Mhm.
But there's a lot of gaps, and you'll have to fill those in. And don't ask me; I don't know. I have no idea how to fill those in. Or you can do something like what you're doing, which is really, really pioneering another path forward. And so I think that to me, I can't imagine there's going to be one way of doing this, and people seem to have success with a variety of ways. I mean, my favorite example is there's a debate among occultists about on the Holy Table which direction the Hebrew or the Enochian letter should go. One camp says they should go one way, clockwise, and the other says they should go
Mhm.
counterclockwise. Both camps have done it both ways, and both have had success. So
Yeah.
that tells me it doesn't really matter. And you can have it both ways. So those would be the main things. Those contain the diaries. And you can download the microfilm, high quality microfilm of the entire diaries if you want to look at the actual manuscripts yourself. And for the early manuscripts, it's not so bad, but Dee's handwriting deteriorates rapidly through the 7 years. And by the time you get to the end, when you get the famous Daughter of Fortitude speech and the wife swapping incident, John Dee's his handwriting has gotten positively terrible, and it's not so fun to work with those manuscripts.
Yeah, so that's a great transition into the wife swapping incident, and I really wanted to talk about the wife of John Dee, Jane Dee,
Mhm.
because I feel like she was also dealing with all of this going on. She was dealing with her husband, she was dealing with these angels talking about wife swapping. Um, what would you say, as a historical figure, what was Jane Dee's role in John Dee's life?
Yeah, and I'll say this to just before I go into it. Everything I'm going to say is I'm just echoing what Deborah Harkness has said in her fantastic essay, "Managing an Experimental Household." It's a fantastic article written by Deborah Harkness. Just know that everything I'm going to say is just coming out of her mouth. So all credit goes to Deborah Harkness. Um, but yeah, Jane Dee really had to manage an impossible situation. She had a pretty large household. You know, we sort of always imagined Dee and Kelly just sort of sitting in a room doing their scrying, but they would have been in a room of many rooms in their house at Mortlake, of which there were several buildings on the property, of which there was at least a gardener who lived there, and there was a guy who ran the alchemical stills, and there were other servants, and you know, a couple of the servants set fire to their bedroom a couple of times, and um, it was just kind of it's imagine that at some level, Dee, for all his genius, he's in the muck of it. He is running the alchemical lab. He is managing his library, which has basically been a bunch of books that they stole from the monasteries. He is managing scientific equipment, and people should also realize that at this time, natural philosophy, what we would call early science, has now become a domestic affair. It's a thing that you do at your house. So if you want to run an alchemical lab, you basically have a building in your backyard that's your alchemical lab, and you run that. And these things stink and they're dangerous. And you know, they Dee and Kelly are talking to angels, and you have all this going on. And well, who's really behind managing all this is going to be Jane Kelly, or Jane Dee rather. Jane is managing all of this. And so you have to think about it from her perspective, is that she's basically managing a house and a research institution. And just imagine how difficult that has to be. And on top of managing a house and a research institution, you're also managing a husband who's up to stuff that could get everyone in a great deal of trouble. Jane has been raised in an environment in which respectability is one of the most important things that she can maintain as a housewife, and she has to maintain a respectable house. You know, the Queen of England has come to their house at one point. So this can't just be like smelling terrible because of there's some weird alchemical experiment going on in the outhouse. She has to sort of strike a balance between Dee's interests and also maintaining a respectable Elizabethan household, all the while appearing meek and mild and obedient and sober and all the stuff like this. So she manages to do something that I think that she manages a household unlike any other household in England, and we must really marvel at this woman who manages to hold together, like I said, a research institution, a domestic household with all the issues of propriety that go along with that. She's also a mother. She's raising children. Um, and on top of all that, she has to do this by balancing out some degree of privacy because, you know, like you can't just have random people walk in on Dee and Kelly talking to angels, which did happen, by the way. People just walked in. They're like, well, "What are you doing?" Um, and then also, of course, she has to manage all the domestic personnel, and she has to do this in a very weird balance because she has to do it by being um, spendthrifty enough to not spend too much money, because you know you're always asking for patrons money, and if you have a bunch of money they're not going to give you any money. But she has to also do it in a way that maintains the nobility of the household. So she's a real genius. And she had a task that no one else, it's not like, you know, Jane could have gone to anyone else in England, or for that matter in the European world, and go, so how do you do this? Because no one had a house like the D house. And so yeah, that's the kind of the queen, you know, sort of the woman behind the throne. That Dee is a bit of a bumbling weirdo, obsessive compulsive in some ways. Um, I mean, if you look at Dee's diaries, you know, and I'm not talking about the angel diaries, but this everyday diaries, Dee records all kinds of like what we would now think of as obsessive details. Like he'll notate every time they have sex. He'll notate the time. He'll notate the when she gets her period, how heavy of a period she gets, because he's technically detailing all this astrological stuff because he wants to know exactly when she conceives and stuff like this. And there's something about like she had a miscarriage and like Dee like basically dissected this miscarriage.
Wow.
Um, yeah, it strikes us as positively bonkers that she would have to have, I'm not a woman myself, but having a miscarriage must be a quite a traumatic ordeal. And then to know that your husband's just like in the other room, like picking at it. It's a, she must have, I mean, I don't know what she thought about that, but and she did it with grace and with sophistication, and she did it well. And the house at Mort Lake was famous, and it was famous, I think, not just because of all of the interesting things that John Dee got up to, but because he was able to get up to those things because basically she was running the empire, and he had the ability to play all these weird roles, but only because she was able to basically make it all work. She's the general contractor. She's the stage manager. A really impressive woman, Jane Dee.
Yeah. It's wonderful to hear about all that. And also, like, it makes me wonder, A, how she must have been feeling at that time. I mean, you're married to such a eccentric individual, all of this going on. And then one day he brings home Edward Kelly. Um,
Yeah, who then was Edward Talbot. And 3 days later or whatever, they realized it was an alias.
and then so she, really felt that he was kind of sketchy from the start. And she had reservations, especially later, about the whole wife swapping thing. But eventually it seems like she was pressured into it. How do you view this interpersonal conflict, especially from Jane's perspective, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, Jane hated Kelly. I mean, I mean, hated him. What Dee would say that she flew into marvelous rages with Kelly. They would get in shouting matches, Kelly and Dee's wife. Um, yeah, she hated him. And I think that, she's trying to protect her husband. She doesn't trust this guy. I mean, he has his ears cut off because he's been convicted of forgery and coining. So he grows his hair long, which at that time was uncouth haircut. But you could see the guy didn't have ears. And the only way that he didn't have ears was because he had been convicted of forgery. He had an alias when he first showed up. He would get drunk and fly into rages. I mean, Kelly would just say blasphemous stuff. He was a really bizarre is maybe not the right word, but for it seems like he had some kind of mental health issues, exactly the nature of which aren't hard are hard to divine. But I think that Jane Kelly rightly distrusted Kelly, or yeah, Jane Dee distrusted Kelly, and also it's easy to forget that he was getting an average income of £50 a year, and that doesn't sound like a lot now, but that was a lot of money. It was a lot of money that Dee was paying this guy. Uh, and again, if you're a wife and you see a shyster dude come into your household claiming to talk to angels that are getting you to do all kinds of strange and dangerous things. I mean, the angels told Dee to go to the Holy Roman Emperor and denounce him to his face. Like, that's a quick way of getting yourself killed in this time period. And Dee did it. And you must have thinking Jane being like, they're not talking. These people are being tricked by demons, or God knows what they're up to. And she's trying to protect her husband and protect her household, right? Because if Dee is arrested and sentenced to death by the Inquisition or by James the First or whatever, well, she's destitute. It's over for her, and so she has to defend her reputation, protect her children, protect Dee to some degree for himself, frankly. And Kelly is just an unstable, disruptive member of this household. Kelly lives there with them. Eventually, Kelly's wife will live there with them, who also is long suffering in this whole story, Joan Kelly. Yeah, she disliked him, and I think that any woman would have disliked him. I think that they would have, women have pretty good intuitions about things. Like when in my experience, when some like shady dude shows up at your front door, and the wife or your sister is like, like, go with that. Like trust that there's a lot, there's millions of years of evolution, where I think women in the house can look at a guy or a person and be like, mm-mm, this dude is not good news. And and yeah, and the wife swapping incident was I think the horrifying pinnacle of this. You know, if you read the diaries there, which Dee tried to erase, he tried to deflect, he tried to deface them so that it couldn't be read. But I mean, she basically collapses into sobbing and violently shaking, tremors for half an hour, when he basically announces that they have to do this to share all things in common. And I mean, there's no way to put it. I mean, she didn't consent to it.
Yeah.
Again, we have to be really honest about what happened here. She didn't consent to this. This was something that was forced upon her, and it's just it's unimaginable. This man that you hate, Kelly, is
Hmm.
now basically having sex with you, and you're not. It's horrible. It's just there's something nightmarish about it,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and that ended it. I mean, that ended it. That ultimately that was the certainly wasn't the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the anvil that broke the camel's back. And at that point, I think D must have come to his senses to some degree. But but yeah, and you see it that when it's all over, there's a sequence in the very end of the diaries where D writes "pactum factum," like it's done,
Mm.
and I think the angel says something to the equivalent, and they're all in the room together, like they're all in the room sitting there, and one of the angels who is again Kelly's talking for this angel, and the angel says something to the equivalent of "Was she obedient unto thee?" And you can just imagine Kelly saying this to Jane D, and Jane D just says yes. And it must have broke her. What a
Yeah.
horrifying. Again, we talk about this wife swapping incident as if they were like having fun, like swingers or something.
Hmm.
This was not that. This was something really vile, and and people rightly say like, "Were those angels? Would angels do that to a woman?"
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's a real good question. I think it's a very real and a very good question, and very much worth interrogating. But yeah, I think Jane Dee's assessment of Kelly was ultimately correct from day one.
Yeah. And I think what was interesting and sort of very telling about another dynamic of this was when Edward Kelly got married and brought home Joan, Jane felt sorry for her
Yeah.
because she was more young and it's like, oh wow, you ended up with this guy. Is that like an accurate assessment of that going
Yeah.
on? Yeah.
Yeah. And Kelly didn't want to marry her. That was the
Hmm.
angel that told him to do it. And this is one of these weird moments where people say, "Oh, this is just Kelly being a fraud," and Kelly, it's not that simple. Kelly also did dangerous things, things that if you were just defrauding someone, you wouldn't endanger yourself by
Yeah.
doing. And he didn't want to marry Joan Kelly, or he didn't want to marry her. And also, Dee and his wife come from an aristocratic background. Jane Frummond, who became Jane Dee, she was in Elizabeth's court. She was one of the courtiers in that world. Joan Kelly did not come from that world. They were very much oddly matched when it came to their class backgrounds. And yeah, I think that Dee's that Jane Dee must have taken pity on Joan. Though I will say this that Joan Kelly the Kelly's marriage did warm up. I think they did eventually kind of fall into love, and she was there with her husband all through the business of him becoming a court alchemist under Rudolph II, and she was there when he died when he broke out of that prison and fell and broke his leg, and she was there at the very end. So
Well.
so she was loyal to him.
Hmm.
So that there is something to be said about Joan Kelly that in his last three agonizing days on this earth, she was there trying to comfort him in his last moments. So again, props to Joan Kelly.
Yeah. Wow. I had no idea about that though. Wow, she had her own role to play in this as well in their
Yeah,
lives, and not often talked about. So thank you so much for taking the time to share some of those more nuanced takes, not only on Kabbalah but also on your work with the Enochian system and John Dee and some of these other tangential things. So I definitely would like to bring it back around and talk more about that Cairo trip. If someone were interested in signing up for that or getting more about the Agrippa class, how could they do that?
Well, the Cairo trip is still in the works. So
Okay.
as soon as I know, people on the channel will know. The Agrippa class, it's basically I'm giving it away. People can sign up for my Patreon and watch it and come live and then do Q&A afterwards. But again, in the interest of accessibility, I'm just putting the whole class on my channel for free, just because I think the community deserves access to the class. I don't. Um, yeah, I just wanted to make it available. So yeah, I mean, the best way to stay up with me is just to stay up with the channel Esoterica. I don't have much in the way of social media. In fact, I don't have any social media. My book business has an Instagram, but I don't have an Instagram. Um, yeah, I don't do social media because it scares me. I'm far more scared of social media than I am any demons that I've read about. So, but mostly you can find me through either my website, which is just justinsledge.com, or through Esoterica on YouTube. And if and when the Cairo trip materializes, or you want to buy a bottle of the absinthe that I'm making, all those will be announced on on my YouTube channel when they become available.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm convinced social media is clipothic, but that's a whole other discussion. I'm completely convinced of it.
Yeah, it's a tree
Uh,
of death if there ever was one. Yeah,
yeah,
social
yes,
media.
it's the night side of the tree. You have to interact the night side of the tree of life in order to use social media. It's a dark place to go.
Yeah, I remember like looking at it when it first dropped, and I was like, nope, not doing that.
Yeah, 100%.
Mhm.
This has been amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this discussion with me, and thank you so much for all of this amazing discussion. I appreciate it, and thank you to all of our viewers and listeners today. As always, I'll put all the links down below, and check out the rest of my videos, the rest of my interviews. Appreciate you being here. I am the center of expression for the primal will to good, and so are you. Bye, everyone.